This is a 2015 Chrysler 200, and we're going to be replacing the rear shocks on this car today. Obviously, the first step is to pull the rear tire off, and it says wheel lug bolts, and that is correct. These are not lug nuts, they're lug bolts, and they're 18 millimeter. It's a Fiat thing ever since Fiat bought out Chrysler. So there's an upper shock mount that's held in with two 17 millimeter bolts. You can see them up inside there. Kind of hard to get at, a lot of dust and dirt falling out of there. And then there's a lower bolt that's a 19 millimeter. I'm going to start by removing the lower bolt first. It's kind of a tight area where it's at. There's not a lot of room to swing the ratchet in there. You can see me trying all these different ways to try to get it out of there quicker. There's just no quick way to do it. I think I ran to my toolbox there looking for my clicker wrench, 19 millimeter clicker wrench, and I obviously didn't find it. So with that bolt loose and out, we can move to the top. You can remove that inner fender liner if you want. It does make the job a little bit easier, but you can also do it without removing it. I was able to get up in there with a universal on the end of my extension there. Well, actually, I didn't have a universal, just a straight extension with a socket. But you'll see later in the video, I actually pulled two of the retainers out to give me a little more wiggle room when I'm putting it back in. It's a little bit harder to install. Plus, there's a lot of dirt and crud falling out of there. Those bolts out, I can pull that bottom bolt out and pull the whole shock assembly with the upper strut right out of the car. We're going to take it over to the vise to remove that upper strut mount, upper shock mount. Now, since this shock is destined for the scrap pile, it doesn't matter where we pinch it in the vise, so just go ahead and put the shaft of the shock right in the vise and tighten it down. We're going to pull that nut off the top, and that nut is a 17 millimeter. The new shock comes with a new nut, so we won't need to retain that nut, but we are going to retain that upper shock mount and put that on the new shock. Came off pretty easy. There's one more thing we got to pull off that old shock, and that's the bump stop. And I didn't realize I did this off camera a little bit, but I basically just put the bottom of the shock between my boots and stood on it, and I pulled up real hard. It took a little bit of force, but you can pop that bump stop right off of there. There's just a little bump on the top of the shaft that it's got to slide past. We're going to install that on the new shock. So if you stand the new shock right on the floor and you push down with a lot of force, you'll be able to pop that right on there. Just be careful you don't stab that into your hand. And now we're going to install that upper shock mount onto the new shock. We're going to have to hold the shaft in order to tighten it down. So what I suggest you do is take a pair of vice grips and put them on the shaft just below the shock mount. That part of the shaft doesn't matter if it gets marred because it'll never see the inside of that shock. That's where the bump stop rides. And if the car ever bottoms out, it's going to bottom out against that bump stop. The new shock came with a new upper nut as well. I just put a pair of vice grips on there right underneath that mount as high up as I could so I don't have to worry about that part of the shaft going down inside the shock and damaging the seal. Okay, it's tight. Let's go put that shock back in the car. Here you can see it's not even damaged. Even if it was, though, it wouldn't matter. I'm going to pull a couple of these fasteners off just to give myself a little wiggle room here. I think that one was a 10 millimeter. The other one's just a big, giant Phillips screw. I had to pull out a little bit on that on the liner there while I unscrew that fastener to get it to come off. That's all you really need to do is remove those. There's enough room to get up in there. You'll want to start the 2 bolts for the upper mount, but just start them. Don't tighten them up yet. Just put them in there a few threads so that that shock won't fall down. That'll give you enough wiggle room to get the bottom bolt started without having to fight it. So now the shock's hanging in there. I'm going to start that bottom bolt. Okay, we're going to move back up to the top. Now that the bottom is tightened up, we can tighten up the top bolts. I pulled that back just so I could get a camera angle in there. Again, these are 17 millimeter. Don't forget to install your fasteners that you took out. Just screw that one in, and then the other one's a 10 millimeter nut. And that's pretty much it. That shock is replaced. I think the hardest part about the whole job is putting those stupid wheel bolts back in place. What was wrong with lug nuts? Seems like they just made it harder for people, but I've noticed that this was a direct result that happened after Fiat bought out Chrysler. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and check out my other videos. I appreciate the support.